This is Who, When, and Why the Writing of the Gospels, Part 8. In the previous video, we looked at the principal objections to my theory on the synoptic problem, the Clementine Hebrew hypothesis, and I showed why I believe my theory is able to hold its own against the objections. In this video, we'll look at some of the more extreme, hyper-skeptical objections to my theory. I don't claim that they're in the same category as the objections considered previously, but some of them are popular, and so I'd like to address them. In a bit of humor, hopefully humor that's taken well, I've entitled this video Dialogue with Trifles. There are 4 principal objections that we will consider. Number 1, Matthew can't have been written in Hebrew because it's based upon Mark and Q, both of which were written in Greek. This is a circular argument. One of the fundamental questions we need to answer in our study of the synoptic problem is, was Matthew based upon Mark and Q? We can't just assume it in advance and claim that we've proved something. I've shown in previous videos why I do not believe that Matthew is based upon Mark, and why I believe that there is no need to appeal to Q. Objection number 2. Jesus and his followers were illiterate, and so they couldn't have written his teachings down, much less come up with brilliant new ideas. In just a handful of words, this objection manages to commit 3 false generalizations. Let's consider each in turn. False generalization number 1. Illiteracy. There have been a number of studies that have sought to ascertain the literacy rates in Galilee in the first century. Perhaps unsurprisingly, they've come up with a variety of results. We might even say a polarizing variety of results. People with access to grind have managed to come up with results that favor their views. We do not know exactly what percentage of Galileans were literate. It's greater than 0%, less than 100%, but we can't say this particular Galilean man definitely was or definitely was not literate. We don't have enough data to say that. What we do know is that it was extraordinarily common, and sometimes in places required, for Jewish boys to be given a basic Jewish education that included reading the Torah. Edersheim, one of the great Jewish Christian scholars of modern times, believed Nazareth probably did have such a school. Now some might say, okay, we'll concede that maybe they could read a few lines from the Torah and write their name, but that's a far cry from writing a book. I agree it is. We'll get into that in false generalization number 2. But to wrap up false generalization number 1, we can't just make the blanket statement they were illiterate. We don't know that. False generalization number 2. None of his followers could have written his teachings down. Even granting that most of Jesus' followers were poor members of society, he also had followers who were publicans, Pharisees, members of the Sanhedrin, people who could definitely read and write well. And even if most of his followers couldn't have written down his teachings well, it would only take one who could. Now, I happen to believe that there was more than one who could, but the de minimis threshold we need to achieve to counter this argument is just one. Let's be clear about what the skeptical position is. It's not that most of his followers couldn't have written his teachings down. No, that doesn't get the skeptics where they want to land. The claim is that exactly zero of Jesus' followers could have written his teachings down. That's a very easy bar to clear. We just did it. He had some literate followers, and it would only have taken one who could write his teachings down. Now, we do need to briefly guard against 2 counter-arguments. One is that you can't claim that he had followers who were publicans, Pharisees, members of the Sanhedrin, because all the early sources that say that are unreliable. We know they're unreliable because they were written late. We know that they were written late because the people were illiterate and couldn't have written down at the time. That's another giant circular argument. They're illiterate, therefore the documents are written late, therefore they're unreliable, therefore the people were illiterate. You can't argue in a circle. And this actually hurts the skeptics' position more than those they're trying to attack. Because the skeptics have to argue that lots of Jesus' followers were poor. How do we know that? The very early Christian documents they're trying to claim are unreliable. This is not good argumentation. In an effort to counter your opponent, you don't want to chop the foundation down that your own argument rests upon. Doesn't work. The second counter-argument against which we should guard is those who say, okay, yeah, maybe he had some followers who could write, but the Gospels, we're talking about top-notch Greco-Roman literature. They couldn't write like that. Well, let's be clear. The Gospels are well-written, but they're not that well-written. This is not the pinnacle of Greco-Roman literature. This is not Plutarch. This is not even Attic Greek. They're written well. They're not written that well. What's brilliant in the Gospels is not so much the literary ability of the authors, which varied among the 4, but the content, and particularly in the case of Mark, the storytelling. The brilliance of Mark is the storytelling. The semantics aren't so good. The storytelling is really good. And we can't just arbitrarily enforce the idea that the person who told the stories and the person who wrote the stories were the same person. As demonstrated in previous videos, we have multiple early attestations suggesting that the person who told the stories, Peter, is not the person who wrote the stories down, Mark. And so we don't need to claim that the writer of these stories spent years studying classic tools of Greek rhetoric. No, what we've got is a brilliant storyteller who heard other people tell good stories and learned how to tell good stories himself. And if you don't believe a fisherman can be a good storyteller, you don't know many fishermen. False generalization number 3. These outsiders, people who were not the elites of their society, couldn't have come up with brilliant new ideas. A look at history suggests that new ideas often do come from the outside. Alexander the Great, the forces of Islam, William the Conqueror were all outsiders to most of the regions they changed, and changed the world they did. Sure, someone might say, fine, but an illiterate person couldn't do that. Really? How about Charlemagne, who was illiterate for most of his life? It should not surprise us when new ideas come from the outside. We see this in the sciences as well. Physicists have long lamented that in most cases, not all, but in most cases, the most fruitful years of a physicist's life, where they come up with new information to add to the discipline, are when they're young, when they're outsiders, not when they are older, consummate insiders. This is not to say that older people cannot come up with new ideas. They certainly can. But it is to say that new ideas are usually the product of people looking in from the outside with a fresh set of eyes. We see this in business as well. One of the classic case studies is how tiny, at the time, Dell upstaged massive insider IBM. Now, there are in many scholarly disciplines people who are uncomfortable with the idea that people without their training could come up with brilliant ideas, and yet it happens. Michael Faraday, anyone? This, in fact, was a criticism lobbed against Jesus and his apostles 2,000 years ago. Human nature hasn't changed all that much. I find it much easier to believe that a paradigm shift came from the outside than that it was the product of people on the inside, living comfortably in the sense of their own superiority under the status quo, with access to plenty of people who saw the world more or less the same way they did. If you want to know where change is coming from, look for the people who are uncomfortable. Finally, I'd like to ask, at least rhetorically, if not Jesus, who then did these brilliant ideas that changed the world come from? And no, we can't blame this all on Paul. Paul swears an oath in Galatians. He testifies in a setting where he can be fact-checked in 1 Corinthians. These ideas did not originate with me. We're talking about a brilliant mind that changed the world. This isn't a case of one really good quote and we forgot where the quote came from. Okay, that happens occasionally. No, this is a whole library of quotes. We're looking at a fundamental revision on the way people look at the human experience. Where did this brilliant idea come from? Some like to attribute it to anonymous, hypothetical communities that they've invented. No, this doesn't work. Brilliant ideas come from a brilliant mind, not a committee. If you don't believe this, you haven't been on many committees. Who is the brilliant mind behind these ideas, and why, if not Jesus, are they forgotten to history? Let's keep in mind, we're talking about one of the best recorded eras in antiquity. Why didn't this brilliant person, whose ideas were so successful, ever develop a following of their own? To suggest that their ideas left a major imprint on literate societies, but their existence as a human being did not, is pretty darn close to believing in phantoms. Objection number 3. Theories like yours just aren't very popular among critical scholars. Oh, I agree they're not. Paradigm shifts rarely are. Now, it is not my intent to claim that New Testament scholars just aren't very smart. No, there are brilliant people working in this field. If you missed it in a previous video, I pointed out that if I have figured out anything in the synoptic problem, it has come by standing upon the shoulders of giants. I also claim that if you start with flawed premises, no matter how brilliant the deduction, no matter how carefully constructed the inferences, you'll never end up with a sound conclusion. And especially in source criticism, scholars are trying to make their theories work within a framework imposed upon New Testament scholarship by 19th century philosophy. If I come up with different conclusions, it's because I'm not using those 19th century philosophical assumptions. I'm trying to go back to the evidence itself. It's worth pointing out that in the textbooks, when Greco-Roman historians, the famous ones, are cited, if it's a non-Christian historian, their material is usually referred to as history. But if it's a Christian historian, even some of the really good ones, their material is usually referred to as tradition, and there are asterisks around it. There's definitely a double standard here. When we look at the philosophical implications, it's pretty clear why that is. In historical criticism, early information is generally given a very high level of authority. Yet with the New Testament documents, apparently the rules are different. Why? Let's take the Gospel of Matthew, for example. If it really is what the patristic writers say it is, early information, multiply attested, written by an eyewitness, this is the gold standard in figuring out what happened in the past. Yet there are many who do not want Matthew and the morals taught therein to be authentic, and so they prefer to believe that they're fairy tales made up years later. In terms of early attestation, independent attestation, multiple attestation, and prevalence of manuscripts, the Gospels rank among the best authenticated documents from antiquity. But people don't feel threatened by Herodotus or Thucydides or Tacitus, so they're willing to quote them without quibbles. But when it comes to the Gospels, many do fear the possibility that their moral precepts could have authority, and therefore they ferociously attack them. Now, you don't want to hear all of this from me, an outsider. Let's take a look at a few statements by insiders, people who worked within this field, people who expressed concern what they saw in their universities and among their peers, that new ideas were being flat out rejected because they were new. From John A.T. Robinson, quote, "In fact, ever since the form critics assumed the basic solutions of the source critics, particularly with respect to the synoptic problem, and the redaction critics assumed the work of the form critics, the chronology of the New Testament documents has scarcely been subjected to fresh examination. No one since Harnack has really gone back to look at it for its own sake, or to examine the presuppositions on which the current consensus rests. It is only when one pauses to do this that one realizes how thin is the foundation for some of the textbook answers and how circular the arguments for many of the relative datings. Disturb the position of one major piece, and the pattern starts disconcertingly to dissolve." End of quote. From Malcolm Lowe. "Students are taught the assured results of historical critical scholarship in introductory courses, only to find, should they consult the professional literature, that these assured results generally have their cogent opponents." End of quote. And perhaps most poignantly, from F. David Farnell. "Could it be that Enlightenment-spawned historical criticism has so systematically ignored the early fathers because they stand as manifest contradictions to its cherished dogmas?" End of quote. I suggest that the answer to that last question is yes. So my theory is not popular among critical scholars. This is true. My theory may not stack up very well against what was written in 19th century New Testament theological journals. But it does stack up rather well against the historical evidence itself. And in my view, that is the much more important criterion. Objection number 4. It is often claimed that the authors of the gospel were far removed in time and place from the events they described, and so their reliability should be seriously questioned. We've already pointed out some flaws in the methodology to suggest late dates for the Gospels, but let's go ahead and look at one very specific piece of evidence suggesting that the authors are not so far away in time and place from what they describe. The Gospel authors show tremendous familiarity with the geography of the regions they describe. Okay, maybe Mark has some trouble with Galilean geography. Give the poor guy a break. He's a Judean. He may never have even been to Galilee. The other 3 Gospel authors certainly do know their geography well. But even weightier than the argument from geography is the argument from names. Here's a thought experiment, an exercise, an experiment you can try out. Without looking it up, can you name the top 10 most popular boys' names and the top 10 most popular girls' names in the area that you're from? This is actually a lot harder to do than it sounds. Names are one of those things that people struggle with. Now let's ratchet it up even further. Now it's the top 10 of each, not from here and now, but from a place you have never been for the year 1960. If you think you can pull this off, give it a shot. Send me an email. This is an incredibly difficult challenge, getting the right names for the right people for a distant time and place. And yet, what do we find in the Gospels? They do get the right names. We can piece together from non-biblical data what the most popular Jewish boys' names and Jewish girls' names were in the first century in the area where Jesus lived. And then we compare those names to the names in the Gospels. What are people called in the Gospels? The Gospels get the right names. They get the right names as being really common. Have you ever wondered why there are so many people named Simon? Simon was the most popular Jewish boy's name at the time. Now, this is true for a very specific time and place, but you go to Alexandria, Jews are called different things there. You go to Rome, different again. This is very specific to the time and place, and the Gospels get it right. Most popular girl's name among Jews in this time and place, from the non-biblical data, it's Mary. In the Gospels, Mary. Number 2, from the non-biblical data, Salome. In the Gospels, Salome. You can work your way down the list. You find the most popular names are showing up as they should, and they even get the disambiguation right. That is, if somebody has a common name, you have to disambiguate them. You have to say, well, which Simon? And this is why in the Gospels and Acts you get Simon Peter, Simon the Canaanite, Simon the leper, Simon the tanner. You have to specify which Simon. Whereas if you're talking about Andrew, not a common name in that time and place, you don't have to do that. So the only disambiguation Andrew gets is, oh, by the way, he has a really famous brother. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. But besides that, no need to disambiguate. Not a particularly common name. You see the same thing with the Marys. Mary of Cleopas, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, Mary Magdalene, and so on. You have to disambiguate the really common names. Now, we've only looked at a handful of names. We could keep working our way down the list. Name after name after name. The Gospels get the names right. They get the frequency of names right. They get the disambiguation of names right. There is excellent scholarship on this topic by Richard Bauckham and Peter S. Williams. I've provided links in the video description to both of their work. If you don't find this evidence really cool, I highly recommend taking a look at their work. It is a remarkable piece of evidence suggesting the Gospel authors really do know the time and place they're talking about. No good author of fiction names a whole bunch of characters the same thing. Does not make for good fiction. But it does make for a good story. If that's what the people were actually called, it shows that the Gospels are writing about real people and real experiences. Now, I'd like to discuss what is far and away the most popular objection to the names evidence. It comes from Dr. Bart Ehrman. Every time he's presented with the name arguments, he responds with the same story. It's a story with a major flaw. And since the internet was lacking any clear, concise statement of what is the flaw in Ehrman's rebuttal to the names evidence, I'd like to present that here. So first, Ehrman's rebuttal, and then I'd like to point out the major flaw. Ehrman says, let's imagine 2,000 years from now, some historians find a book that records a story about a Dr. Bart Ehrman teaching at UNC Chapel Hill, and on a given day he went to this lecture hall in this building to give a lecture, but there was a terrible gas explosion and he didn't make it. Ehrman then points out that all of those details are true except the critical gas explosion. And he says that the scholars 2,000 years from now could look at their other data sources and say, oh wow, there really was a Dr. Bart Ehrman. He really taught at UNC Chapel Hill. There really was this lecture hall and building. These are all real data points. This story must be true. The gas explosion must have really happened. And of course, Ehrman points out the gas explosion didn't happen. It sounds like a compelling argument. It suffers from a critical flaw. The question is not whether we could fool the historians 2,000 years from now. The question is whether we could fool the people encountering this story a few decades from now. Because a few decades from now, somebody can raise their hand when that story is told and say, oh no, I was there, I was in that lecture hall on that day, and that isn't what happened. And if people can raise their hands and do that, then this story will be branded as a fraud from the get-go. It will never get off the ground. It will never become one of the most trusted, revered, and widely disseminated stories in all of history, as the Gospels have. That the Gospels did not encounter that particular type of early opposition suggests that they never got the really destructive critic's review that every author fears will prevent their story from ever becoming a bestseller. If the people who knew the time and place could shoot the story down, it would never attain credibility. And so it doesn't matter if you can fool the historians 2,000 years from now. What matters is, can you fool the people who are the original recipients? significance of the story. And even allowing for late dates of the Gospels, that a lot of the critics like to put them in the late 1st century, even allowing for that, all 4 Gospels were still written at a time when there were multiple eyewitnesses of Jesus occupying prominent leadership positions in the church. If there were any palpable frauds in the Gospels, they could have been readily called out. I happen to think that the dates of the Gospels should be pushed earlier in the 1st century. We'll cover that in more detail in section 10 of this series. But even allowing for the late 1st century dates, you've still got eyewitnesses who can call out the fraud. Airmans' argument doesn't work because this story is being published when there are people who can say, I was there. That isn't how it happened. What the historians 2,000 years from now think is irrelevant. What matters is, what do the eyewitnesses say at the time the document is published. So, the evidence from names by itself shows that the authors were very familiar with the time and place they described. But they could have still written fiction, right? Well, when you pair the evidence from names with early dates from the Gospels, now, no, they can't. They can't get away with stories that are clearly invented out of whole cloth. It's interesting to consider 2 premises that the skeptics often make here. Think about this. A, okay, we'll concede that the Gospel authors were very familiar with the time and place. But B, they were writing at a time when everybody who was familiar with the time and place was dead. Yeah, think about that for a minute. The evidence from names is a fantastic rebuttal to the idea that the Gospel authors were far removed in time and place from the events they were describing. In conclusion, let's summarize the ground we've covered. Objection 1, Matthew can't have been written in Hebrew because it's based on Mark and Q, which were written in Greek. Circular argument. Objection 2, Jesus and his followers were illiterate, and so they couldn't have written his teachings down, much less come up with brilliant ideas. In just a few words, there are 3 false generalizations. Objection 3, your theory isn't very popular with critical scholars. What of it? If it's a better fit with the historical evidence than it is with 19th century theological journals, I'm okay with that. And objection 4, the Gospels were written by people who were far removed in time and place from the events they described. We've just shown some pretty significant evidence demonstrating exactly the opposite. The Clementine Hebrew hypothesis stacks up pretty well against the hyper-skeptical claims made against it. Only one of the 4 objections we considered, the first one, which was circular, even interacts with the key premises of my argument. The others are just pretty generic claims of hyper-skepticism, where people want to impose their own philosophies on the Gospels rather than looking at the evidence itself. I'm going to stick with the evidence. And if higher criticism must continue to appeal to fantasy, for which we do not have evidence, rather than tying itself to history, for which we do, then I suggest it may be time for higher criticism to take a higher critical look at itself. As for the Clementine Hebrew hypothesis, we've considered the objections, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I submit that the hypothesis has held its own against the best and the worst that can be thrown at it. I stand by the basic premises I outlined in video 6 of this series. What we have here is a solid, evidence-based, and disarmingly simple response to the synoptic problem. A quick bit of bonus material here, a PS at publishing time. Some are concerned that my theory commits a deus ex machina fallacy. You have a magic solution that comes out at the end and tidies everything up. No, it's exactly the opposite. Some wish from the synoptic problem to find an algorithm. This always gives you that. This always results from that, and so on. They want a closed-form solution to the synoptic problem. But this doesn't work. No matter where you stand on the spectrum, from total inspiration to total forgery, these are still documents written by human beings, and there is no closed-form solution to the human mind. If we're here trying to figure out how robots wrote the synoptic gospels, no wonder we're struggling to solve the synoptic problem. You can't take the human factor out of the synoptic problem, and so I've left it in. I'm willing to allow for a little bit of chaos. I'm willing to allow for the possibility of unpredictability in a human author. And so far from bringing a deus ex machina, I've left it in human hands. If our approach to the synoptic problem is at one extreme, we're expecting a purely mathematical exercise in code breaking, or at the other, we envision a full, final, complete manuscript being set on a pedestal by an angel. At either extreme, the synoptic problem will remain intractable, because we have failed to account for the human factor.